So, should we start the interview now?
Yeah, I thought we started.
Yeah, so did I.
It's a recording studio. We're always in
record.
record.
Yeah, of course. So, going back to the beginning then.
Oh.
Introduction.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. This is the recordproduction.com interview. And we're very lucky today because we've got the living legend that is Chris Kimsey with us. And we're in his room even, in Sphere Studios, with his Sony digital desk, which we ought to talk about that a bit. But Chris, how did you get into the biz? You had a job at Olympic, didn't you?
Yes, I had a job at Olympic.
What made you want to get a job at Olympic? Why did you do that?
I had a girlfriend that lived around the corner, and it was very convenient. No, I did have a girlfriend that lived around the corner, and I used to live. Where was I living? I was living in Cheam, I think, and she was in Barnes. So I was very much interested in sound and music, in so much as at school I would do the sound and music for school plays.
Right.
I wasn't into Hendrix per se or bands. I was just more into film music actually.
All right.
And
were you a musician at all? Did you play?
Yeah, piano and
right.
timpani.
Oh, excellent.
I made my own timpani sticks. So this girlfriend, I walked past Olympic Studios and go, wonder what's in there. So one day I went in and said, have you got any jobs? So I must have been about 16.
Yeah.
Coming to the end of like the GCSEs, the exams and summer, and they said no. But I used to go back every other week, and in the end, Anna Menzies, who was the studio manager, she said, "You again? Okay. What's your name? What's your number?" And put me down. But
so you'd worked out what went on there roughly by this stage.
Yes, that it was music recording, but that was all. I didn't know.
Right. You had no idea what went on.
No idea
right.
apart from that. And then. I think it must have been about 6 weeks later. I'd another girlfriend. her brother owned a shop fitting company, and he offered me a job as going all over England as a shop fitter, which was very good overtime, very good money. So I thought, oh great, okay, I'm maybe nearly 17 now, and I've got to have a proper job, shop fitter. And then 2 days before I was supposed to start that, Olympic phoned up and said, can you come for an interview tomorrow at 9 o'clock? So I went, oh, okay, fine. So put on my best tie and white shirt and went down there and met Keith Grant,
right,
who's the studio manager. And Keith showed me around, and I was absolutely amazed because there was a 4-track recorder, and they were just unwrapping an 8-track one, I think, at the time. And there were 4 speakers up on the wall, and Studio One. And the mix-down room, which was called the reduction room, and took me around the place, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. And then he said, okay, step into my office, I've got some questions for you. So I thought, oh shit, that's it, I'm never gonna get past this. It'll be some physics question or something. Anyway, he said, how do you wire a 13 amp plug? Well, this I knew. I could wire a 13 amp plug. I knew how to do that, and that was the question.
Brilliant.
And then 2 days later, I got another call saying, can you start Monday morning? £11 a week. And that was it. And I started as a T-boy. And the very first day I was there, I was told to go up to Studio One and sit quietly on the sofa in front of the speakers and, just sort of disappear, but go and observe. And I walked in, and Alan O'Duffy was the engineer on the session. I think it was a jingle session. And he looked at me as I walked in. He said, do you work here? I said, yes. He said, great. Can you take over? Because the assistant's gone sick. He's not feeling very well and he's run off. So I said, okay. So I sat down and picked up the tape box and the pen and figured out they were doing take 1, take 2, write it down, press record. I knew how to do that because I had a Revox at home. I had a G36, I think. So I just sat down and sort of, did the tape op thing.
Brilliant.
And then about half an hour later, the session finished. And Alan said, great, what's your name? I don't know you. How long have you been working here? I said, well, about an hour. And my name's Chris Kimsey. And he remembers that story to this day. He always remembers that. So that was my first day in Olympic. And Olympic was just a fantastic learning ground because you, unlike today, you had maybe 4 different sessions in a day. You'd have a jingle session from 8 till 9:30, then something else from 10 till 1, then a film session from 2 till 5 or 6, and then you'd have bands in from 7 until about 1 in the morning. So spent a good year and a half, I think, doing all the daytime stuff, and then I got put on a Glyn John session. And once Glyn sort of discovered me, that was it. He wouldn't have anybody else because he was very exacting, and I knew that, and I understood that, I think, and wanted to please him. So I made sure everything was. I mean, in those days, you'd have to do a complete turnaround. You'd have to strip down maybe a 40-piece orchestral session, and then set up for a rock band within an hour.
Yeah.
And I mean, really strip everything down.
Amazing.
You'd have to put all the gobos up, get the drum riser out, have it all set so the roadie could just come in and plonk the gear down. All mics plugged in the right channels where Glyn or whoever the engineer was wanted them, all tested.
Yeah.
So the engineer just came in and pushed up the faders, and that was it. Try doing that in the studio now in an hour.
Yeah.
You'd be very hard.
Presumably a few less mics being used on the drum kit.
Yes, that's very true
these days.
Yeah. But that is a good thing about Sphere, that they're doing a huge amount of orchestral sessions and live, rhythm section things. So the engineers are getting that knowledge, which is really important, rather than having no knowledge of microphones and placement. So that's how I got started.
What was your big break then? Apart from your big dramatic tape-op break?
Well,
what next?
The big break really for engineering was I was an assistant on a Johnny Halliday album. The producer was Lee Halliday. The engineer was Vic Smith, who went on to be Vic Smith Heaven. He was a house engineer at Olympic. The Halliday sessions were really interesting because enormous budget, so they would kind of hire the hip musicians at the time. So they'd have like Peter Frampton, Ringo Starr played on some tracks, Jim Price, trombone player with the Stones, Gary Wright from Spooky Tooth on keyboards, Klaus Vormann on bass, Johnny's guitar player at the time was a guy called Mick Jones, who was living in France and was touring with Johnny all the time. Well, Mick obviously went on afterwards to form Foreigner. That was Mick. So the musicians on the session were really top notch. But for some reason, Vic didn't enjoy these sessions. I don't know why. I've never asked him, but he didn't enjoy the French side of it, maybe. Right. And I think I'd been on maybe 2 or 3 days, and then Vic called in sick one morning. They were deliberating who should engineer the session, and Lee looked at me and said, "Can you do it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And that was it. After that, I think I've made about 6 or 7 albums with Johnny. Yeah, and we're really good through different stages in my career, different periods. But he is a star. Yeah, he's unbelievable. I mean, really unbelievable. He's such a professional. And it's always a joy to work with him. So, yeah, so that was my big break. And through that, working with Frampton and Gary Wright, then I sort of got reciprocal work to work with Peter on his solo albums and to work with Gary on some Spooky Tooth stuff. So really, that was the big break through Johnny.
So what was the point at which you officially left the books of Olympic? Did they say, "We're not going to pay you anymore"?
No, I think what happened was after... I remained a tape-op for what I thought was a long time. It may have been like 2.5 years, maybe 3 years. But Keith said the longer you can do that, the more knowledge you'll have, which was very wise. And then it got to a point where I was working consistently as an engineer for Olympic on kind of the projects that people were coming to me for, like Peter and 10 years after. And at that point, I thought, well, I'll go it alone. It was the same time, I think there was another engineer called Keith Harbord, who was one of my best friends at Olympic, and Keith was doing exceptionally well. He was working with Led Zeppelin. He'd worked with the Stones before I worked with the Stones as an engineer. And so I think after a couple of years of engineering for Olympic, I decided to bite the bullet and just go freelance. Right. And that was it, really. Yeah.
Were you at Olympic when Jerry Boyes was there?
Jerry had just left.
Right.
I think I met him for 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
But then I did see him at Sound Techniques.
Right.
I remember meeting him down there.
Yeah.
And I think he was he at the last Olympic reunion? I can't remember. They're always good fun. Yeah, Keith would turn up in his pyjamas normally. Keith Grant.
What's he been up to since the demise of his tenure there?
Well, I still see his name on orchestra on films.
Things, doesn't he? Yeah.
And he's got a studio. I know he's got a studio at home. He lives. Where does he live? He lives near. He lives on the river somewhere, not Maidenhead, somewhere. But I know he's got a studio there, and I think he's also got something in a church. He's always doing bits and pieces.
Yeah. My first ever interview was at Olympic, when I wrote to all the studios, and he showed me around. It was 1984.
Okay.
So I had the tour a lot, just like you did, sort of the control room looking down.
But the thing with Keith is he wasn't really. I mean, what he told me, he was looking at the person rather than the knowledge of physics or anything.
I was really unlucky because I wrote, and he said, "I've just got your letter." He rang me up the day it arrived, and he said, "I just got your letter. We just took somebody on yesterday, but come and have a look round anyway."
Yeah.
Because he obviously liked my letter.
Yeah.
And I obviously ended up at Livingston under Jerry's auspices. So
well, that's a great studio. That was good.
Yeah.
It's been a great studio too.
It has been,
yeah.
I was lucky there,
yeah.
Absolutely. So, so you got to work with the Stones and engineered Sticky Fingers.
I did a little bit of engineering on Sticky Fingers. Again, it seemed to be the situation of the engineer wouldn't turn up. That Glenn didn't turn up for a few sessions, so I ended up recording. I know I recorded the saxophone on Brown Sugar,
right?
Because Bobby Keys always rubs it into my the wound. It was a period when they were some masters were Dolby'd and some were undolby'd on the 8-track, and I think I'd recorded him with a Dolby. Whoever mixed it didn't have the Dolby on, so his saxophone sounded a little bit strange on the record.
Sounds all right to me.
Yeah, it sounds right to me too. I'm surprised Bobby could hear it actually. So I did quite a few vocals on Sticky Fingers, and that's how my first introduction to the Stones really.
So was that a bit of a buzz working with the Stones?
No, yeah, kind of. But I was never ever. I think.
You weren't a fan?
Well, no, it's not even that. But because my love of music was actually more with film music and orchestral, the whole rock and roll thing was like, okay, well, this is okay. But the fact it was the Rolling Stones, or if it was Eric Clapton or the Who, or that didn't impress me or faze me.
That's probably why they liked you.
I think that was part of it. And I became very good friends with Ian Stewart, the keyboard player, who was in turn, he and Glim were very, very close as well. Right. And I think that when Glyn decided that was it, he'd had enough. He and Stu had a little powwow and said, "Well, who are we going to suggest for the Stones?" And my name popped up because I remember actually I'd been working in New York, I think with Peter Frampton, for quite some time. It may even have been. Could it have been the Frampton Comes Alive album, or could it? I'm not sure, but I know I've been working in New York with Frampton, and I just got back to London, literally the day after, and Stu called and said, "Kimsey, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm just unpacking my suitcase. I've just got back from the States." He said, "Don't bother." He said, "You're coming to Paris to record the Stones." So I went, "Oh, okay, fine, right." And then that was Some Girls,
right,
and that was the beginning of the, I think, 7-album relationship.
Wow. So I remember hearing lots of Stones stories, of course, during my tape hopping upbringing. And legendarily, Charlie Watts won't let you EQ his drums because you won't hit them while you're not running the tape. Or is this true that he won't?
No, he'll let you EQ them, but he won't.
He won't spend time bashing them for you.
No, he won't. No. You got to get the sound while he's performing. Yeah. I mean, you might get like one hit of each drum, but that's it. But quite right too. there was one. I remember there was one day in Paris where it took me a while to realise not to turn up on time for sessions, because the session would be called at 7 o'clock. I get there at 7, and 1 o'clock in the morning we're still waiting for the band to arrive. So after a while I figured that one out. But there was one day when I went in and I'd got there, even so I was still early. And so I sat down at the drums and I'd start playing them and hitting them. And Charlie's tuning is unique to Charlie. Any other drummer hitting the drums would go, "What the fuck's this? This is really odd." It is odd, but his expression and the way he plays it, it makes total sense. But I decided I think I'd tune the snare drum, like, you know, just one, two turns. That was all. I thought, yeah, it's better. That sounds better. And then Charlie came in and he had this wonderful thing of very particular about his clothes, and folded his jacket up very neatly and sat it down in his scarf and sat down, and he'd sit down and he hit the drum, and the first strike of the drum, he was in shock, and I see him looking around and he's looking at the drum and scratching his head. And I walked out, I said, "Charlie, what's wrong?" He said, "Someone's touched my drum." And he knew from just like literally not even maybe one turn of the key that someone had touched his drum. I said, "Yeah, it was me." He said, "Oh, okay." That was it. But he knew. I mean, I was totally amazed that he could tell. But that's because, you know, I think because he's being a jazz drummer, it's all touch. It's not, you know, sort of clout. It's not hammering. It's really finesse. Yeah. And it was really quite a joy to experience that, to see him realise that. A lot of it's by accident as well with Charlie. Maybe too many drummers today are too precise. Maybe they're too. Although saying that, I was watching Little Feat the other day, and Richie Hayward's a very good friend. I've worked with him a lot, and what a drummer he is. But he again, this is interesting. You fit on an interesting thing here because, okay, so working with Charlie, they do maybe 7 or 8 takes of a groove, a new song, and come in and the biggest bridge to cover in recording for them was when they go to the bridge or the chorus, because it was all on a nod and a wink, because nobody really knew where it was going to happen when it felt right. And I realised that after a while that Charlie's drum fills, instead of leading into the chorus or the bridge, the chorus would happen and then Charlie would do a drum fill after the fact, which made it quite unique and special. And I said to him on one occasion, I said, "Charlie, it'd be great if you could actually lead into the chorus." He said, "Lead into where?" You know, even he didn't know where the chorus was or the bridge. It was like, you know, just a feel thing, a complete feel thing. So, and then working with Richie Hayward, Bill Payne of Little Feat, who is a very exacting musician, reads and writes music. Richie can't read music. So Richie was always dependent on someone giving him the nod and the wink to where things were, because he, you know, wouldn't read a bar chart. And I think there's some of that when it's less worked out, when it's not worked out. Something unique comes into it. Right. When it's all kind of perfect and mapped out, then you just get the beats. You don't really get the style of the drummer.
So would you edit a lot of Stone songs when you've done takes? Would you do a lot of and in the sense of not just editing to get the best bits, but actually structuring the song a bit, or
yes, use a bit of both actually. I mean, the actual title song "Some Girls," which, you know, was hundreds of verses about what girls Mick liked and what girls Mick didn't like, and I think went on for about 12 minutes. 12 minutes of verses with only maybe 3 or 4 bridges in that 12 minutes. And I remember Mick and Keith coming back into the control room and listening back to it all. And Mick turned around and said, "Okay," he said, "make it about 4 minutes. Pick the verses, you know, pick what verses you want." I went, "Okay, fine." And it was on 16 track. So I started editing, and about 10 minutes he came and said, "You've done it?" I said, "Fuck off." I said, "I've got to get it from 12 minutes to 4 minutes. It's going to take me a little bit longer than that." And I think actually every verse was from a different place. It wasn't continued. It was. I remember the master, the multi-track going past. You couldn't see much brown. All you could see was white. But see, now that's another interesting. Though there was no click in those days. There was no. It was down to the drummer's timekeeping, and I'm always amazed when it's always nice to tell drummers and bands today that you don't really have to have a click, because if you're any good as a rhythm section, you should be able to chop between takes quite easily. You know,